My name's Paul Llewelyn. We can have a little chat about traditional farming methods in this part of Wales. Most of the farms in this part of Wales were very small. They were subsistence farms, and for example the cattle were milked in order to produce butter, in order to produce whatever the farmer needed, and of course they were milked directly into a wooden pail. These were then carried by usually the wives who did the carrying, by these things. I don't know if Helen can sort of model that at all, but this is a typical yoke that farmers would use to carry pails of water, pails of milk around the farm. So things would be suspended on your shoulders. The milk was then eventually decanted into large bowls like this. These are sycamore bowls. Sycamore was the wood of preference because it doesn't impart any flavour into your foodstuff. So the milk was poured into this, let stand, and then when it separated out, the fat from the top was skimmed out. This is a skimmer, again made out of sycamore, and the fat was skimmed off the top there and then placed traditionally in the large wooden churns. But what we have here is a late 18th, early 19th century butter maker, and the butter, or the thick processed the cream was poured into this, and that was turned until it thickened up and the butter was formed. That then would be placed out onto a board and belted into shape by these guys. These are butter pats. These guys were used to form the butter into a solid form, often with the use of this, almost like a plasterer and his hod. And then that eventually, if they were selling the stuff, were placed into moulds. Here's a butter mould, which you can see rather nice patterns on them. The butter was then placed into that, and when it had sort of dried off a bit, it could be pushed out and put out for marketing. Lots of the companies had their own logos on them, and this is quite a nice mid 19th century sycamore mould. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah. And then that then was usually when they were marketing the stuff. But the milk was also carried around to the local villages in the churns, and the milk was sold not in bottles as we have them today, but it was ladled out using these tin ladles, and these had to be verified by the Crown. The weights and measures people would check them. A little lead stamp would have been placed on them, so you could have your pint, your half pint, or whatever, so that you weren't being diddled. Although there was a practice, and I think it probably still happens now and again, that milk was thinned out a little bit by adding a drop of water so you can maximise your profits. The other jug that was used for carrying this stuff was, oh golly, I don't know if you can reach any of those, Helen. Up on top there with the harvest jugs, behind that the copper one. There we are. This again is probably 200-year-old. This is a harvest jug. This is what the milk would have been. Whoops, milk would have been carried around in, and again that's a 1 gallon jug. It's had a hard life, and as you can see they're quite important items. This one's been repaired many times. Extremely crude, simple repairs, and this would have been the tool of preference to carry your milk around for selling. So, and then today, of course, in the 20th century, we started to put milk into churns, and of course that was picked up when it was weighed and measured, and you didn't, they actually gave you the quantity of milk by weight, and this is a scales that was used, a scales produced in the early part of the 19th century, and it, not pounds or ounces on it, well there are pounds on it, but it actually puts the number of pints and gallons. So the churn was weighed, and that would give you the quantity of milk that was in the churn. Okay. And of course the milkmaid would need, she wouldn't be on her haunches, which would need, this is a very primitive, early, so this could even be 16th, 17th century stool for them to use. But in Wales there are distinct designs, regional designs. This is a typical Carmarthen stool, wonderfully done. This one has has been painted many times, not worth stripping it because it's a part of its history. And they're beautifully made, and again made on a pole lathe, very simple construction. And some of them are actually dished because they also used to stand the cheeses on them to drain. So they had a multi-purpose. And of course the more primitive stools, like this one, they reckon the hole in the centre, this is a very early elm top stool, very likely 17th or even 16th century, had the hole in it again, if the cheese was stood on there, it could drain into that hole. Okay, in this little section we're going to talk about early lighting. When the landed gentry and those with money were able to use things like candlesticks out of silver, copper, pewter, the ordinary working people didn't have such pleasures. They, on the whole, had to make do with things called rushlights. Now rushlights are blacksmith made items that will hold. Have you seen the rushes? That will hold a rush that has been soaked in fat. Now, how this process works is that the rushes were cut largely with a blacksmith made bill hook. Oops, like this. Rushes were cut, and then somebody in the family had the great job of peeling at least a third of the outside off the rush. The rush then was placed in a trough, which is called a grisset. Now a grisset, here's a grisset, this is a very Welsh grisset. This again made by this blacksmith or even cast. This was placed under any joint that any meat that you were processing. All the fat was gathered in this, and the rush was soaked in that to suck up all the fat. They were then taken out and hung to dry. They would then be placed in what we call a rushlight. Now rushlights are quite quaint little things. The rush would have been placed in that, and they reckon the one would get 15 to 20 minutes of burning, very poor light, almost like a candle, out of one rush. Now this is an interesting little rushlight. It's been beautifully made. The artisan skills can be seen with the different rushlights. The chap who made this was obviously quite a skilled craftsman. Yet you get slightly cruder rushlights, like this one here, which again, beautifully made. This one would be from North Wales, and it's got a slate base to hold it. But again, you can see that the quality of the work is it's fairly rudimentary. But of course, they were just basic lighting techniques. On the weight, the counterweight then would hold what was your burning rush in place. On very posh days, you could use candles. Of course, there was a tax on candles, so people didn't use candles that much. They used to use candles only for special occasions. So this one has a counterweight of a socket and a candle. But there are tremendous regional differences. This one, again, quite crudely made. It's been in the ground quite a bit, I think. But unfortunately, the candle socket has disappeared. They had different bases. Some had wooden bases, some had slate bases, others had tripod bases. Again, instead of the counterweight, some had springs. Now this is beautifully made, and we've got a feeling this one might have come from the Isle of Man. If you can focus in on this, the bottom of each foot has a boot on it. And the spring then, spring loaded to hold the rush in place. Quite a beautifully made thing. And again, whoever made this was a really skilled blacksmith. And as far as the Welsh ones are concerned, this is typical. This was from Machynlleth, mid Wales. The cruciform shape, very crudely made, well nibbled with worm, but it's a beautiful thing in its own right and fit for purpose. But there are also other forms of lighting. I mean, they also use things like this, which is called, well, the Scottish method, I can't remember what it's called now, but this would also clip a rush in place. But this was normally the more Scottish type of clip for holding the rush in. And of course, the people also use, oh, there's a nice early, this sort of form of lighting with rushes and homemade candles. These go back to almost certainly to the 11th century, and they were well before that. I would imagine this sort of technique would have been used during the Roman times. A simple candle socket that would have been driven into the wall, and your homemade candle would be placed on that. Same with this one. This one had an advantage of having an extra piece on it, oops, in which the rush could be jammed. So that would also hold a rush as well as the candle. So you had the alternative of cheaper lighting if you didn't want to pay for candle tax. And the other thing they used was whale oil, animal oil. And in Scotland they would have used bird oil. They would have boiled up their auks and their gannets and the oil from these, and whale oil would have been used in these containers. These are called cruises. The oil would have been placed in there, a little wick coming out, and excess oil would have dripped into the second chamber so it didn't cause a fire. And as the oil went down, you tilted it so that the oil would reach your reach the wick, and these were just hung from rafters or driven into the wall. The earliest ones didn't have a second bowl. The earliest ones were like this. This is quite a primitive one. They were cast, single bowl, but I think what happened with a lot of the early ones, an awful lot of house fires occurred, because you can imagine a wick burning away, piece dropping off onto your straw floor, wallop, and then you're really in trouble. But this is an interesting one. It had a very interesting ratchet mechanism, so you could vary the height if you hung it above your dining table or your kitchen. It's a trammel system used for raising and lowering your lighting. And of course they also produced these, which were hanging lights, again to vary the height over your dining table or over your kitchen table when you were working. So the strap and hook would just be used in order to raise it. Again, rushlight or candle, depending on the amount of light you wanted or who was in the house, who you wanted to impress. And with the oil lamp, there's the luxury of a 4-chamber one. You could have 4 wicks hanging out of that one. Again, no second chamber to stop it, but this is a very early one. This is probably, it could easily be 16th century. But when you think of that, blacksmith would have knocked that out, and that would have been the ordinary person's method of lighting his home. Yes, ordinary people didn't have the luxury of gold and silver and brass and bronze sort of lamps. Other forms of early lighting were quite interesting. Certainly with regards to the agricultural community, the blacksmith would have made, if he didn't cast it, he would have made a light like this, which had been made out of flat steel, and a retainer, and a mechanism here with which you could raise the candle. If you can see, as you turn that spiral around, the candle would raise as it was burning. It could also be hung on the corner, or anywhere really, wherever they wanted light. But it's quite a sweet, simple method of lighting. I suppose it would have been not the poorest of the farmers, but this would have been somebody had a couple of quid to be able to pay the blacksmith to make something special. Again, if you're going out to your stables, another blacksmith piece is this stable light. This was produced as a safety light, and so if you fell over it wouldn't have caught things on fire. Couldn't guarantee that looking at it. But again, the candle could be raised as it was burning, and that again could be hung at the side of the stable wall whilst you were mucking out or sorting your animals out, or if it was lambing time or whatever. But again, beautifully made, artisan made stuff. And the other form of lighting, the really early ones, the tin workers were really special. They made these things. These probably would have been, the people who made these, it probably would have been what you call them, suits of armour makers, you know, the tin plate makers, and they would have made these lights. No windows as such, and what you had with these are just pierced holes, beautifully made, really well made, just enough light so you could see where you were going. You could wander around your premises, check everything right, check the animals are okay, just enough light to get you to sort of see where you were going. And as things progressed, they produced a light which had a window, and of course glass was incredibly expensive, and what they used in those days was horn. This is compressed horn, cow horn. The horn would have been boiled up, the candle would have been put inside there. The horn would have been boiled up and rolled flat, and it would make these translucent windows. Horn was used for a multitude of things, everything from spoons to cups, all manner of things. And of course again we've gone back to pre-kerosene. This would have been the oil lamps. This would have been a whale oil lamp, again very similar to the cruises that were hanging. The oil was placed in there. The wick would be coming out of this particular spout, set alight, and then any excess oil or any oil that was dripping would go back into the reservoir, and this could be topped up again. This is a weighted base, but sometimes you get these with 3 or 4 spouts on them, depending on the how much money you've got, really. But it was again a very good method of lighting the house. And of course in the 19th century, instead of the old-fashioned method of having your string and just constantly dipping it in the fat so that it would build up layers, so the old candles were quite lumpy and strange, they formed the tin makers, made these beautiful candle makers, and they would have used beeswax, sometimes fat, and the beeswax would have been poured into these. The string would have been dropped down through the centre, come out through little holes at the bottom, tied, and probably a piece of stick going across there so that they were centralised, and then the hot fat would have been, or the hot beeswax would have been poured into these and allowed to set. Then you've got some really nice tapered candles. Again, the tin makers, the tinman's art, it's an incredible skill. From flat steel to be able to produce that is absolutely wonderful. Now we're looking at some other sort of early farming implements, if you like. Here we have, of course, when you're looking after animals and livestock, you had to quite often medicate them. Traditionally, animals were placed into what we call the hospital fields. These are the fields which were species rich in herbs, wildflowers, wild plants, and they had all the elements that you possibly want. And a sick animal was often put into this field. But often the local herbalists would make solutions and concoctions to give to your animal, and what you used to call drenching. You open the animal's mouth, you pour the concoction in by using a horn which is modified, like this. Solution would be put in there, that would be driven into the side of the animal's face and then poured down his neck. In the 19th century they become a little more refined. This probably belonged to a vet. I'd guess this is so well made. Again, the solution would have been placed in there and that forced into the animal's mouth, down his throat, and that would have administered any medication that the animal would have needed. As I say, this one's probably 19th century. We do drench them today, but we use slightly different methods. And of course when the animal is prepared for slaughter, poor old pigs, poor old cows, I mean the same method of medication would have been used for everything from sheep, cattle, horses, would have always had these sort of instruments to use. And then the husbandry again, looking at their hooves, their feet, foot rot with sheep, and split hooves and disease with cattle. And the blacksmith would make these wonderful little knives for trimming and cutting excess or rotten material from the hooves. These are beautifully made, and again, blacksmith made. The local blacksmith was probably the most important man in any village. And of course, to keep your tools sharpened, let's go back to slaughtering. When your pigs were slaughtered, what you had to do, of course in the old days pigs were very hairy. Not like today, we don't see it, pigs are hairy today, but we don't see the processes. So what they used to do, use these things, this is, what did I call it? Hog scraper, that's right. This would have been used to pull the hooves off the pigs, and you would have set fire to the fur either by putting straw over the back and setting fire to it, or rush a candle over it, and that would be used then to scrape all the hair off the back of the animal. Or another method would be a multi-purpose tool like these are hog scrapers. The candles would be used to singe the hair, and the base of this would then be rolled over the outside of the animal to clear the bristles off. So the animal could be prepared, it could be dried, it could be salted, it could be hung up in the kitchen and cured. There we are. That's a different story, that one is there. And of course, everybody had to get their tool sharpened. Not like today, where you can, where if a tool becomes blunt, they buy a new one. In the old days, if you're out working in the field with your scythe, wonderful instrument like this, or your sickle, your job was to keep the damn thing sharp. It wasn't an easy job. So what they used to do is carry a thing like this, which would clip onto your belt, which would be full of coarse sand. Or if you had a big estate, they used an item like this. Again, a large longhorn cow. The sand would have been poured into that, and then this would just be for holding the coarse sand. And they used a thing called a strickle, which is a piece of wood like this. This was then covered in fat, sand poured over it, and then they used this to hone your blades to keep them nice and sharp. And this was done regularly, every 15-20 minutes or so, just to keep that edge up to scratch. And of course, if you were using the scythe, you were actually using the sickle. You used a thing like this. It's so easy to take your fingers off if you weren't proficient at it. So you put that on when you were cutting the grass with your sickle to move the grass as you were chopping, so you wouldn't catch your hands, or move the hay, should I say, not necessarily grass. So that would stop you from chopping your fingers off. Wonderfully ingenious and so simply made.